The Black Sabbath lead singer Ozzy Osbourne has died at the age of 76.
For decades, Ozzy Osbourne seemed impossible to stop, no matter what happened. The scandals, the addictions, the health scares, the controversies. Ozzy always found a way to come back. Again and again, he survived things that should have ended his career, even his life. That's why millions of fans believed he would somehow keep going forever. After all, this was the man who helped create heavy metal, the man who fronted Black Sabbath, the man who sold millions of records, packed stadiums across the world, and became one of the most recognizable figures in music history. To fans, Ozzy Osbourne wasn't just a rock star. He was a survivor, a legend, a force of nature. But in the final years of his life, something changed. The man who once ran across massive stages in front of screaming crowds was suddenly struggling to walk. The performer known for his limitless energy was increasingly confined by health problems. And the rock icon who had spent decades entertaining millions was fighting a battle that no amount of fame or success could solve. For longtime fans, it was heartbreaking to watch. Because behind the sunglasses, the wild stories, and the larger-than-life reputation was a man whose body was beginning to betray him. And the hardest part? Ozzy never wanted people to feel sorry for him. Even as his health declined, he continued trying to perform, continued trying to create music, continued trying to prove that he was still the same person fans had always admired. But the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The years of hard living, the accidents, the surgeries, the illnesses, they were all taking a toll. To understand why Ozzy's final years became so tragic, you have to understand where the story began. Long before the world knew him as the Prince of Darkness, he was simply John Michael Osbourne, a working-class kid growing up in Birmingham, England. His family struggled financially. Life wasn't easy, and few people could have predicted that the shy young boy from an industrial city would one day become one of the biggest names in music history. When Black Sabbath formed in the late 1960s, nobody knew they were about to change rock music forever. Their dark sound, their heavy guitar riffs, and Ozzy's unmistakable voice helped create an entirely new genre. Heavy metal was born. The success that followed was extraordinary. Albums sold around the world. Concerts became larger. Fans became more devoted. And Ozzy became one of the most recognizable frontmen in music. But fame came with a price. Throughout much of his career, Ozzy battled alcohol and drug addiction. Those struggles became legendary. Stories about his behavior filled newspapers and magazines for decades. Some stories were exaggerated. Others were painfully true. Yet somehow, Ozzy always managed to survive. Every time people thought he was finished, he came back. He rebuilt his career. He reunited with Black Sabbath. He launched successful solo albums. And later, he became an unlikely television star through the Osbournes. The reality show introduced Ozzy to an entirely new generation. Suddenly, millions of people who had never listened to heavy metal knew exactly who he was. They saw a different side of him. Not the rock legend, not the Prince of Darkness, but a husband, a father, and a surprisingly funny family man. For a while, it seemed as though Ozzy had conquered every obstacle life could throw at him. But time catches everyone. And as he entered his 70s, years of physical punishment began catching up with him. At first, the signs were subtle. A cancelled performance here, a postponed tour there. Fans worried, but they assumed Ozzy would recover like he always had. Then came the diagnosis. Then came the surgeries. Then came the devastating health setbacks that would define the final chapter of his life. And suddenly, for the first time, even the most loyal fans began asking a frightening question. Could this finally be the battle that Ozzy Osbourne couldn't win? For most of his career, Ozzy Osbourne seemed indestructible. No matter how chaotic life became, he always found a way back. That's why many fans were shocked when his health began declining so rapidly. The first warning signs appeared through cancelled appearances and postponed performances. At first, fans weren't overly concerned. Ozzy had dealt with health issues before. Most people assumed he would recover and return to the stage. But this time was different. Much different. In 2018, Ozzy suffered a serious infection that forced him to postpone several shows. Soon afterward, his health problems became even more severe. Then came one of the most devastating accidents of his life. In 2019, Ozzy suffered a serious fall inside his home. For most people, a fall would be painful. For Ozzy, it became life-changing. Years earlier, he had survived a near-fatal ATV accident that left metal rods and screws in parts of his body. The fall aggravated those old injuries and caused significant damage to his neck and spine. Suddenly, simple movements became difficult. Walking became painful. And the recovery process proved far more complicated than anyone expected. Doctors recommended multiple surgeries. Months of rehabilitation followed. The man who once commanded stadiums full of fans was now spending much of his time focused on basic physical recovery. Then came another heartbreaking revelation. In early 2020, Ozzy publicly revealed that he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. The announcement shocked fans around the world. For years, rumors had circulated about his health. Now, people finally understood what he had been battling. Parkinson's is a progressive neurological disorder that affects movement, balance, and coordination. There is currently no cure. And for someone whose entire career depended on performing in front of audiences, the diagnosis was devastating. Yet even then, Ozzy refused to surrender. During interviews, he remained determined. He spoke openly about his struggles. But he also made it clear that he wasn't ready to quit. Again and again, he expressed a desire to return to the stage, to perform, to do what he loved. That determination inspired millions of fans. But the physical reality was becoming increasingly difficult. More surgeries followed. Recovery periods became longer. And every attempt to return to normal life seemed to be followed by another setback. Throughout it all, one person remained constantly by his side. His wife, Sharon Osbourne. For decades, Sharon had helped guide Ozzy through some of the darkest periods of his life. Addiction, career setbacks, public controversies, family struggles. She had seen it all. Now she faced perhaps the most difficult challenge yet. Watching the man she loved struggle with declining health. In interviews, Sharon often spoke honestly about how difficult the situation had become. There were moments of hope, moments of progress, but there were also moments of frustration and heartbreak. Fans could see it too. Every time Ozzy appeared publicly, people analyzed every movement, every interview, every performance. Everyone wanted to know how he was doing. And while many admired his courage, it was impossible to ignore the physical toll these health battles were taking. Yet despite everything, Ozzy continued trying to give fans hope. In 2022, he released new music. He continued making appearances. And he repeatedly insisted that he wasn't finished. For lifelong fans, those moments felt inspiring. Because even as his body struggled, his passion for music remained untouched. The Prince of Darkness was still fighting, still creating, still refusing to give up. But behind the scenes, the challenges were becoming overwhelming. The surgeries, the pain, the constant recovery, the uncertainty. They were slowly transforming everyday life into a battle. And as the years passed, many fans began realizing something heartbreaking. Ozzy Osbourne wasn't just fighting Parkinson's. He was fighting for the ability to continue being Ozzy Osbourne. And the next chapter of his life would become the most emotional of all. Because the question was no longer whether he wanted to return to the stage. The question was whether his body would allow him to. For decades, Ozzy Osbourne lived for one thing: the stage, the lights, the crowd, the energy that came from standing in front of thousands of screaming fans. It wasn't just his job. It was his identity. That's why one of the most painful realities of Ozzy's final years wasn't the surgeries. It wasn't the hospital visits. And it wasn't even the Parkinson's diagnosis. It was the possibility that he might never perform again. For someone who had spent more than 50 years entertaining audiences around the world, the thought was devastating. Yet as the years passed, that possibility became increasingly difficult to ignore. Every attempt to prepare for touring was met with new physical challenges. Recovery took longer. Pain became harder to manage. And simple activities required more effort than ever before. Fans remain hopeful. After all, Ozzy had defied expectations his entire life. If anyone could make another comeback, surely it was him. But even legends have limits. In interviews, Ozzy began speaking more openly about the frustration he felt. He wasn't afraid of hard work. He wasn't afraid of recovery. What hurt most was feeling trapped inside a body that could no longer do what his mind wanted it to do. He still loved music. He still wanted to perform. But his health was making those dreams increasingly difficult. For many fans, some of the most emotional moments came when Ozzy discussed his audience. Again and again, he expressed gratitude for the people who had supported him throughout his career. The fans who bought albums, attended concerts, and stood by him through every success and every mistake. Those supporters had been part of his life for more than half a century, and the thought of disappointing them weighed heavily on him. Despite his struggles, Ozzy continued searching for ways to stay connected to music. He recorded new material, worked with other artists, and remained creatively active whenever possible. Because even when performing became difficult, his passion for music never disappeared. That passion had defined his life since the beginning. It wasn't something illness could take away. Meanwhile, his family watched everything unfold. For Sharon, Kelly, Jack, and the rest of the Osbourne family, these years were emotionally exhausting. They had spent decades helping Ozzy survive challenges that seemed impossible. Now they were watching him fight one of the toughest battles of all. The battle against time. The battle against a body that had endured decades of punishment. And the battle against limitations he never imagined facing. Yet through it all, Ozzy continued showing remarkable determination. Even when walking became difficult. Even when pain dominated his daily routine. He still spoke about future projects, future music, and future opportunities. That stubborn determination became one of the defining characteristics of his final years. He refused to surrender. But eventually, reality became impossible to escape. The large-scale tours that once defined his career were no longer realistic. The physical demands were simply too great. For many fans, accepting that truth was heartbreaking, because it meant acknowledging something they never wanted to believe. The era of Ozzy Osbourne dominating the world's biggest stages was coming to an end. The man who had once seemed immortal was facing the same reality every person eventually faces: age, physical decline, and the limits of the human body. Yet even as one chapter closed, another was beginning. Because Ozzy's legacy was no longer measured by ticket sales or concert attendance. It was being measured by something much bigger. His influence, his impact, and the millions of lives he had touched throughout his extraordinary career. And in the final chapter of Ozzy Osbourne's story, that legacy would become more important than ever. Today, when people talk about Ozzy Osbourne, they often focus on the headlines, the controversies, the wild stories, the outrageous moments that made him one of the most talked about figures in music history. But those headlines tell only part of the story. Because behind the image of the Prince of Darkness was a man who achieved something very few artists ever accomplish. He changed music forever. Long before heavy metal became a global phenomenon, Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath were helping create it. Their music inspired countless bands, countless musicians, and entire generations of fans. Without Black Sabbath, the history of rock and metal would look completely different. That influence is impossible to measure. It can be heard in stadiums around the world, in albums released by artists who grew up listening to Ozzy, and in the millions of fans who still discover his music decades after it was first recorded. For all of his struggles, Ozzy's career remained one of the greatest comeback stories in entertainment history. Time after time, people counted him out. They said he was finished. They said he would never recover. They said he would never return. And somehow, he always found a way back. That resilience became one of the reasons fans admired him so deeply. Because Ozzy wasn't perfect. He never claimed to be. He made mistakes. He faced consequences. And he spent much of his life battling personal demons. Yet he continued fighting, continued creating, and continued finding ways to connect with audiences around the world. In many ways, that's what made him relatable. Fans didn't see a perfect celebrity. They saw a human being. Someone who struggled. Someone who failed. Someone who got back up again. And someone who kept moving forward despite overwhelming obstacles. As his health challenges became more severe, public perception of Ozzy began changing. People no longer focused only on the rock star. They focused on the man. The husband who had spent decades with Sharon. The father who loved his children. The grandfather whose family meant everything to him. And the artist who desperately wanted to keep doing what he loved. Those final years revealed a side of Ozzy that many fans had never fully seen before. A vulnerable side. A determined side. and a deeply human side. Even when performing became difficult, his love for music never disappeared. Neither did his sense of humor, nor his appreciation for the fans who had supported him throughout the journey. Perhaps that's why so many people found his final years so emotional. Because they weren't watching a celebrity story. They were watching a person confront challenges that millions of families face every day. Illness, aging, loss of independence, and the struggle to hold on to the things that matter most. Yet even through those challenges, Ozzy's legacy continued growing. Today, his influence extends far beyond music. He became a cultural icon, a television personality, a symbol of resilience, and one of the most recognizable figures in entertainment history. Very few artists leave behind that kind of impact, and very few careers endure for as many decades as his did. In the end, the tragic final years of Ozzy Osbourne were never really about defeat. They were about perseverance. They were about courage. And they were about a man who refused to let adversity define him. The body that once carried him across the world's biggest stages may have weakened, but the legacy he built never did. Because legends aren't remembered for how they fall. They're remembered for what they leave behind. And Ozzy Osbourne leaves behind a legacy that will continue inspiring music fans for generations to come. The Prince of Darkness may have faced his greatest battles in his final years, but his story remains one of the most remarkable journeys in the history of rock and roll. If you enjoyed this documentary, be sure to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. What is your favorite Ozzy Osbourne memory or song of all time? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.